I think he's insane. I think he's evil as evil can be.
All the way through, this guy is a serial murderer.
When I was standing next to him, every instinct in my body was somebody should put a gun to his temple and pull the trigger.
He thought I was Jesus for real. So I let him tell his story to me. Guard opened the door and there he was, smiling, going, I knew you were Jesus. You come to take care of me.
Haddon Clark started worshiping Jack Truitt because he thought Jack Truitt was Jesus Christ.
I beat him up a lot. He would ask me, Jesus is supposed to be nonviolent. I said, yeah, but I'm trying to beat the devil out of you.
And then, the worst thing of all, he murders a little girl. Oh, God.
He wrote his whole diary out to me. I asked him, I said, why did you do this to these people? He said, I saw my father do it. He's told me he's killed people in Provincetown, Block Island.
Haddon probably killed several people up in Massachusetts.
When he was in the Navy, he said he killed people in every port he was in. He said, I liked what she had on. I put her clothes on after I killed her. All these pictures that he drew were crime scenes.
About 70 miles an hour.
He is just evil incarnate.
As soon as he gets out, we're going to track him down, and we have to put him in the ground. We're going to kill him.
My name is John Patrick Truitt. Most people know me as Jack because I don't like John. Nothing against the Johns in the world, but the only time I got called John is when they put me in prison. In 1999, I was doing a life sentence for murder. One of the jurors, I had dated his daughter, and he did not like me. It wasn't a good trial. I've been in prison for 26 years, never expected to get out. I was being transferred to another jail, along with about 8 of us. This guy that got on the bus with all of us was doing this, rocking back and forth, going, making this god-awful weird-ass smile. Which, you don't do that in prison. You don't stare at somebody, especially the way he was staring at me with this grin. Like you would see in one of them movies, like The Joker. Crazy. I said, God, I hope that's the last I see of him. We get to the cell. The door opens, and there he is. I'm thinking, this ain't right, man. He looked at me and he goes, Jesus, I know God sent you to me. I have a lot to talk to you about. I said, no, you don't. I got up in the bed, turned my back on this guy, and went to sleep. The next morning I wake up, he's sitting over on the toilet and just writing. He told me, I want to tell you everything I did so I can be forgiven. he really believes that I'm Jesus Christ. He had to confess to me that he killed someone in every state in the United States. I'm like, who is this guy? He's going, nobody knows this. But I know where Michelle's buried. I said, who the hell is Michelle?
I remember when Michelle was turning 6, she had her birthday party arranged for her class to come to Chuck E. Cheese. I'm Carl Dorr, Michelle Dorr's father. And I have this picture in my mind of her doing the can-can with all the little girls and boys and just giggling and having a good time.
Michelle Dorr is a cute little 6-year-old with brown hair and a bubbly personality. I am Jim Trusty, and I worked at the state's attorney's office in Montgomery County. Unfortunately, she was a kid that was going through some tough times in terms of a pretty, what's the word I would use? A pretty angry divorce.
On Memorial Day weekend in 1986, Michelle's mother, Dorothy, had made plans to travel to Virginia Beach, visit her family. I had physical custody of Michelle. I thought we would just have a nice leisurely May 31st. I would do whatever Michelle wanted that day. My time was her time. It was a very hot day. I stuck a hose in the kiddie pool in the backyard, went back to the house, watched the Indianapolis race.
Carl knew she was going to be out in the yard, and he kind of settled into watching the race. And the hours really passed without any sort of event.
Michelle came inside the house, saw her get the multicolored towel that she was carrying, go out the back door, felt that I heard that Jeff's children were home. Jeff Clark was another separated father who had a good friend of Michelle's at the time, Elizabeth. I assumed that Michelle was outside next door at the Clark family.
My name is Jeffrey Clark. Michelle was a family of divorce, and so she came to visit her dad every other weekend. She would come over and she made friends with Elizabeth. So it wasn't unusual for us to come home from not being here and find her sitting on the front stoop waiting.
5:45, I walked over to the Clark house, looked in the backyard. There was the Clark family. I asked them, where's Michelle? And Jeff said, well, she's not here. And I said, what do you mean she's not here? She's been here playing with Elizabeth. No, Elizabeth hasn't seen her. That didn't register at all. So that completely freaked me out. And I started to panic. So we had a neighborhood search. Dorothy, Michelle's mother, didn't tell me where she was going to be or leave a number other than to say that she was going to see her family. And I didn't have a number to call her either. Then I just pointed my car to the nearest police station and reported her missing. We went over the last time I approximately saw her when she came inside the house. Probably around 2 in the afternoon. And that's really the last time I laid eyes on her. The police, they took it very seriously. That night there wasn't anything I could do, and I was worried to death. The following day, the detectives, wanted to start doing investigating and asking questions and that sort of thing. They pretty much just wanted the facts, and one of the things they wanted me to do to clear the parents was to take a polygraph test, which I immediately agreed to. Of course, they start with easy questions like, what is your name, date, and birthday? And then they start asking questions about Michelle. I told them At the best I could remember last seeing Michelle was around 2 o'clock that Saturday afternoon. But I wasn't sure. But I had been watching the clock. And then they started asking questions about if I had done any harm to Michelle. And then later, Detective Farrell told me I failed the polygraph test. And no, you've got the wrong guy. And he says, no, I've talked to Michelle's mother. And she tells me that you would have done something with Michelle. And I'm accusing you of having killed your daughter.
Carl Dora was Michelle's father, and he was married to Dorothy, or Dee Dee as we call her. That marriage had fallen on tough times, and there had been a lot of negative comments made, including Carl threatening to the effect of, you know, if I can't have Michelle, you won't have her either. So they put a lot of time and energy into really cracking Carl Dora, trying to find out if he had a horrible secret that was going to solve the case very quickly.
I knew I was the suspect at that point. The detective was in my face, screaming at me. If we don't find a child like Michelle's age, and it's been over 24 hours, that means your child is going to end up dead. It was a terrible, terrible experience. And it was going to drive me nuts.
The police canvassed the neighborhood to see what kind of information anyone would have. One thing that was helpful was a gardener nearby who, during the course of that afternoon, wanted to borrow a telephone from the Clark household, who lived next door to Michelle Dora. So he was in the doorstep of the Clark household, and he was met by Jeff Clark's brother, Haddon, who briefly talked to him. He remembered asking for a phone, but also seeing a small girl inside the house. No real deep description there, but something that at least started to make that link between Michelle Dora and the Clark household.
I remember the kids and I were out back there cooking hamburgers and hot dogs and having a, Memorial Day weekend kind of day when all of a sudden these cops come swarming into the backyard. Michelle was missing, and they asked about her, so I'm like, go through the yard, look, the general questions they were asking if, when we'd last seen Michelle, where we had been, and of course they asked about Haddon. So, unfortunately, as you look around my home and you see the chaotic nature that I live in. Here's a few pictures I found. So this is me right here in the middle. This is Brad. This is Haddon. Haddon was born in 1952. I was born in 1955. My brother Haddon had serious developmental issues when he was still very little. My mother worked very hard to provide what she could. Haddon could smile. He could do nothing else. He could at least give a good smile once in a while. Things were wrong with Haddon from the start.
This is a prepaid call from Haddon Clark, an inmate at a Maryland Correctional Facility. You get my letter I wrote last week?
Yeah. I saw your mom. She called you bad names.
She called you. My brothers and sisters called their friends out of it.
How does that make you feel?
It hurt me mentally.
He didn't talk. I remember stories about My mom having people over and just manipulating his body when he was really little, trying to get his muscles moving.
Did a lot of people tease you?
Yeah, yeah.
When I was starting to walk, my mom would knock me down to try to prevent me from getting the gist of it because Haddon wasn't walking yet. There were mental things that were not right.
I was raised like a girl anyway, so it doesn't matter.
Why did they raise you like a girl?
Sometimes my parents would use that as a punish. Instead of getting kids to go with me, they had me wear a dress for school.
If you were to describe your mother in one sentence, what would you say as a child?
If someone showed me a picture of her right now, I'd probably tear it up. My mom was an alcoholic. Well, most of the time, my mother was evil. She did a lot of evil things.
When your mom died, were you sad?
No.
You weren't sad, not at all.
No.
Haddon spent a lot of time in different specialized schools to try to deal with the just other matters that caused him to be antisocial.
My family moved to Ohio, and I stayed back in Pennsylvania so I could go to a trade school.
When he graduated from high school, I guess that would be 70 or so, Haddon got into the Culinary Institute of America, and after that, he just started traveling around, taking jobs here and there.
We started to see this pattern. He'd have a job, he'd get fired, he'd take off with all of the cutlery and slash all the tires in the parking lot. In 1985, Haddon had been discharged from the Navy, and he was kind of in between work, in between housing, so he went to stay with his brother for a while.
He had no place to go, and he needed my help. So I invited him to come stay for 6 months. I met Stephanie, who became my wife, during the time Haddon was living here. And I didn't want him to know her. I didn't want her to know him. So I asked him to move out because he'd already overextended the time I had offered to him by more than double.
On the day Michelle disappeared, Jeff ordered him to leave. And Jeff took his family with him, including Elizabeth, just to kind of clear the way to let Haddon get his stuff together and get out of that house.
So we were gone for hours.
A short time later, the detectives brought Haddon to the Montgomery County Police Department to talk. On the day in question, he basically said he was at his job at Chevy Chase Country Club, and eventually there was a time card that was presented to them that showed being at the club at 2:46 p.m. If the times were rigid, if 2:10 was exactly the last time that Carl had seen his daughter, and if 2:46 was exactly the time that Haddon Clark showed up for work at the Chevy Chase Country Club, it was a pretty effective alibi. It was literally going to be impossible to show that this man had time in that window to kidnap a small child or clean up the crime scene as he might need to do. Law enforcement didn't spend any real time and resources focusing on Haddon Clark at that point, any more than any other neighbor.
As I was watching the news, I guess on Saturday night,
all I can say is basically we are asking a lot of questions. Part of the investigation is questioning people. We have to question all of the family members.
I started hallucinating. I thought the police were talking about me or something odd, and it's just a total disintegration of my mental health. I got this delusional thinking that I could somehow, bring her back to life or something. It was just the only way I could cope. It was the only hope I had of ever seeing her alive again. Days after Michelle was missing, I had this delusion of grandeur that I had this power of resurrection. And if I had that power, then I must be Jesus. So I went to tell Michelle's mother. And unfortunately, this guy, Edward Jagan, was there. Ed Jagan was a private investigator that had injected himself into the search for Michelle. Earlier that week, for some reason, Ed Jagan was obsessed with the crawl space under my bedroom in Silver Spring. So I'm thinking to myself, maybe he's killed my daughter. And he's giving me all of these clues that he's buried Michelle under my crawl space. So I accused him of being the devil, and we need to go to my house in Silver Spring and find Michelle. So they called the police, and that's where they searched.
Michelle disappeared from her father's home. He's given conflicting accounts of the event, including claiming to have buried her in his house.
And that's the story that got out in 1986, that I confessed to killing Michelle and burying her in the crawl space.
So at no point did you ever confess?
At no point did I ever confess to myself having killed Michelle.
Carl Dorr was saying all sorts of outlandish things, such as she's under a crawl space. They would go check the places that he specifically identified, and there was nothing there. And so they realized during that interrogation, this guy was losing it. I mean, the stress of losing his daughter, the stress of being accused, the stress of public accusation, all of that conspired to put Carl Dorr in a terrible state of mind.
The waiting and hoping go on, but tonight the physical search for 6-year-old Michelle Dorr is ended. Michelle's father is no longer under psychiatric evaluation. What do you hope for?
I hope that somebody has her that hasn't harmed her. That's what I hope.
Do you still feel that you'll see her someday?
I hope to God, yes.
Like any homicide case, time is not usually your friend if you're trying to solve it. And in this case, Michelle's body was not turning up. And it just got to a point where it started to fade from public conscience. It was really nowhere to go. In October of 1992, there's another high-profile missing person in Montgomery County.
She was a resident of Bethesda. She lived there with her mother when she wasn't in school. My name is Ed Tarney. I was a detective investigator in the Major Crimes Division of Montgomery County Police. At that time, Haddon Clark was working for her mother as a gardener.
I'm Richard Fallon, and I'm a retired Montgomery County Police homicide detective. We told our sergeant that that gardener was a guy named Haddon Clark. Well, the sergeant just froze and looked at me and he said, "Haddon Clark?" I said, "Yeah." He said, "That was the suspect in Michelle Dorr." After we started looking into the Michelle Dorr case and go back and try to figure out what happened, why wasn't Haddon a suspect here? And you find out, well, he was, but he had an alibi. And so I said, okay, well, we'll check that out.
There was a very short period there from Carl seeing her last to Haddon punching his time card. So Carl essentially had given Haddon Clark an alibi because of the time that he said he last saw Michelle. I remember reading in the case file that Carl was just saying some bizarre stuff. Was going through a bitter divorce. His daughter's missing, and the police are all over him. He just had a breakdown. I just put myself in his place, trying to understand why he was acting the way he was. And it just dawned on me. I went to him one afternoon. I said, "Carl, this is what I think happened. I think you fell asleep and you lost track of time, and you didn't want to be blamed as an irresponsible father in this divorce situation. And I think you embellished that time. And he admitted to me that was true.
And I'm expected to give them a minute-by-minute blow of what happened that afternoon. I made a statement to the best of my ability at that time. And the best I could do was approximations.
When we talked to him, he started marching the time earlier and earlier in the afternoon to something closer to the lunch hour than 2 o'clock. And that made a big difference in terms of crumbling Haddon Clark's apparent alibi.
It certainly gave Haddon enough time to do his deed. During that investigation, they found out that Haddon, that night, went to Naval Medical Center after he got off work. He had a cut on his hand, maybe cut himself with a knife.
So we're thinking he murdered Michelle Dorr. We just can't prove it.
6-year-old Michelle Dorr vanished over the Memorial Day weekend in 1986 while playing in a wading pool in her father's backyard. At first, police suspected him. Now the case is reopened and police are focusing on Haddon Clark. Clark lived with his brother 2 doors down from Carl Dorr.
As soon as the cops had told us that Michelle was missing, I knew that Haddon was responsible for whatever had happened. At the time, it was only suspicions and there were not yet facts to really back things up.
At the time that Michelle Dorr went missing, Jeff and his new girlfriend had left for the day, and Haddon was left there alone to move his stuff out. And I remember we gathered everything up and went down to the residence, and we did a search.
They then came back to us, to me, to ask if they could do forensic work upstairs.
We thought he might have killed Michelle upstairs in Elizabeth's bedroom.
And that led the detectives and the investigators upstairs to this very small room. And they investigated heavily. And one of the things that was most fascinating, the wooden grooves, the wooden slats of the floor, had an appearance of something that had been soaked in a material and then cleaned.
We tore up the entire floor in the bedroom. And that's when the chemist was able to develop what she believed was human blood.
And that's where they found the leftover blood down in the cracks from Michelle.
Montgomery County Police were very busy yesterday. In Silver Spring, they were searching for evidence and collected evidence in the home of Jeffrey Clark, Haddon Clark's brother.
At that point, I contacted everybody that lived in that house to find out if anybody had bled in that bedroom. And the prior owners said there was nobody that bled up there. So, was it Michelle's blood? DNA wasn't as developed back then as it is now. So, with that, all we have is mitochondrial DNA.
Mitochondrial DNA was actually very new back in 1999. It's more exclusionary than it is inclusionary. They couldn't say this is Michelle Dorr's blood, but they could say that the blood was inconsistent with the occupants of the house, the Clark family. And when you start with that basic presumption, we have this opportunity to say this is where it happened.
I think I already had a form of knowing that it had happened here. But I'm just so grateful that forensic science has come along.
Bright-eyed 6-year-old Michelle Lee Dorr was last seen alive on May 31st, 1986. Now, 12 years later, police have finally arrested the man they believe to be her killer, Jeffrey Clark's brother Haddon. Despite extensive searches earlier this year, Michelle Dorr's body has never been found.
I mean, there was a lot of challenges in this case, and one of the biggest handicaps was that we did not have a body recovered.
Sometimes a circumstantial case, jurors can understand those because it's just a common sense thing.
We actually think that Michelle, in a lot of ways, is a victim of him being evicted. Haddon Clark was the type of guy who would get very angry, who would take offense, and who would overreact.
Michelle came to the house. He said that Elizabeth was upstairs playing in the bedroom and she could go on up. Since he was a chef, he had these knives. And that's when he went upstairs and confronted Michelle. And he killed her in Elizabeth's bedroom.
I should have went to my brother's house. That's where all the trouble started.
I welcomed him into my home. He had no place to go. And then, the worst thing of all is I'm realizing he can't stay here, and I tell him he has to leave. He gets so mad at me, he murders a little girl. Oh, God. I don't know how he got evil. I don't know when he got evil.
Haddon Clark was convicted of second-degree murder by the jury. The conviction carried a possible penalty of 30 years. He got 30 years. In the immediate aftermath of the verdict, it was mostly just a feeling of relief.
Michelle was, a 6-year-old with her whole life in front of her. She wanted to be a teacher when she grew up. And that day is not going to happen, unfortunately. I'm just so sorry she was at the wrong place at the wrong time, and she met Haddon Clark.
We were happy we had taken a shot at this case, that we'd gotten a good result, that we'd gotten him off the streets for effectively what would be the rest of his life. But there were open questions. Where was Michelle's body? It always nagged at us,
After Haddon is convicted, he gets sent to the Western Correctional Institute in Western Maryland.
So, Haddon, will you tell me more about when you were with John Truitt?
John told me to call him Jesus. He's manipulated.
He's full of crap.
He's not Jesus. He's an ass.
Oh, God. Well, then, telling you, this is bullshit.
He told me if I call him Jesus, he could get me to a hospital for my mental problem, which was a lie. Never did.
In 1999, I'm on the 3rd day with Haddon, and I don't know what I'm going to do with him, some of the stuff he's coming out of his mouth with. Well, he had no problem telling me about how he ate body parts. This is mental stuff. Well, I just told him, I said, look, man, whatever you're saying, just write it down. When you feel like you need to tell me something, draw it, write it. Don't talk to me about it. And he said, okay. And that's when he started, man. He was just going crazy, writing down. Haddon's art was so creepy.
What was your favorite subject in school?
I would say art. That's a gift I had as a child. Only time I got an A in school was art. I was an Italian artist.
Why art? Because you can express yourself through the drawings?
I'm not the greatest artist. I'm good enough artist.
Oh, the people have real big eyes. There's drawings of everything. If you see it, you'll go, oh, I don't want to see that no more. He would draw clues to other people he killed. And then he told me he killed Michelle. I was like, oh God, what I wanted to do this guy killing a little girl. I said, why are you telling me? He said, because you're Jesus. He was convinced I was Jesus Christ. I mean, no doubt. He believed that my Father had sent me into the system to help him confess all his crimes and to move on. You're a prisoner, and you're put in with this guy. He's talking to you like you're Jesus Christ, and he believes it. And I started playing with that. I told Haddon, I need to know where this little girl is resting. Then I called my wife, Jackie, and I said, Jackie, please call any law enforcement that you may know that you can trust.
He thought this guy was a nut job, but for some reason, Jack thought maybe he could find Michelle's body. Jack called me one night and said that he was in the cell with Haddon Clark and that he had killed a little girl named Michelle Dorr and that her body had never been found.
All I could think about is somebody doing that to my kids. I would hope and pray that they would be doing what I'm doing.
That's when I went to the police department and they gave me Joe Gamble's number.
My name is Joe Gamble. I was a Maryland State Police homicide detective. January of 2000, I traveled to Western Correctional Institute to interview Jack. Jack is pretty laid back, more laid back than I'd ever seen anyone in the prison system. And he's kind of a cool guy.
Back in the 60s and 70s, I was responsible for bringing cannabis to the shore. And I'm kind of proud of it.
Jack told me that Haddon had murdered Michelle Dorr and buried her in a park in Montgomery County, Maryland.
Joe would ask him, what do you think about this? I said, I don't think he's lying to me, man.
I then request one of the correctional officers to bring Haddon Clark into the room. I introduced myself to him and said, I understand that you'd like to talk to me, but as long as he stays, looking at Jack. They said, well, he can stay.
That's true. He had told everybody, if Jesus is not with me, I'm not talking.
When I introduced myself, he was quiet. Once we broke through there, it was almost like this more shy kind of person was now kind of excited that he had an audience. And he was very excited about sharing details.
Joe's got the ability. You can trust him. And me being in there, Haddon could pick up, I trusted him.
So Haddon was telling me about how he buried Michelle, where he buried her, and how exactly he did it. Now, back 25, 30 years ago, on a reclining chair, you would have actually a box spring with metal springs, you know, the size of a seat. He said he dug a hole and then put the body in the hole. And then he put a box spring over top of it and then cover that up with dirt and leaves. He said that way animals, if they started digging down, they would run into those metal springs and wouldn't be able to dig the body up. I've dug up a lot of bodies in the woods and in fields all across the state, but never had I encountered someone that had thought it through that well to actually put a metal box spring over the hole. And I could tell that this man had murdered people before. It was obvious that he had been involved in some very horrific acts. There was no doubt in my mind, though, there were other victims out there.
Over here! Got something!
Các bạn, hôm nay mình sẽ gửi tới các bạn nhạc phẩm nữa được thể hiện bởi ca sĩ Thanh Lam, bài hát Cho Em Một Ngày. Cho em một ngày thôi, một ngày không khắc khoải chờ đợi, một ngày không mưa rơi buồn tủi, một ngày không tê tái heo mây. Cho em một ngày thôi, một ngày không có đêm vời vợi, một ngày đôi chân không mệt mỏi, đường về không có lá vàng rơi. Là một ngày anh đến không chỉ hẹn cùng em, một nụ hôn say đắm sau những lời đầu tiên, ngày mùa đông ấm áp trong vòng tay anh nồng nàn. Một ngày cho em một ngày dịu dàng, là một ngày anh đến như ước nguyện của em, một ngày em reo hát như tiếng cười của anh, ngày mùa đông ấm áp trong vòng tay anh nồng nàn. Một ngày cho em một ngày dịu dàng. Cho em một ngày thôi, một ngày không khắc khoải chờ đợi, một ngày không mưa rơi buồn tủi, một ngày không tê tái heo mây. Cho em một ngày thôi, một ngày không có đêm vời vợi, một ngày đôi chân không mệt mỏi, đường về không có lá vàng rơi. Là một ngày anh đến không chết hẹn cùng em, một nụ hôn say đắm sau những lời đầu tiên, ngày mùa đông ấm áp trong vòng tay anh nồng nàn. Một ngày cho em một ngày dịu dàng, là một ngày anh đến không nhớ tên của em, ngày mưa một ngày mưa reo hát như tiếng cười của anh, ngày mùa đông ấm áp trong vòng tay anh nồng nàn. Một ngày cho em một ngày dịu dàng.
Every summer, thousands of holidaymakers flock here to the British seaside to enjoy the warm weather, the pebble beaches and the amusement arcades. But there's another side to these shores, a sinister underbelly of violence and murder, where sins are washed away in the tide and where the seafront is stalked by sadistic killers who, like the ocean itself, have no respect for human life. My name's Dr. Nell Darby. I've written extensively about the history of crime, researching the reasons why people kill. Over the course of my career, I've developed a keen eye for spotting trends in a killer's behaviour. Nowhere are these trends more striking than in the not-so-sunny seaside towns of Britain's coastline, which have always seemed to attract an extraordinarily high number of murderous rogues. In this series of Murder by the Sea, I examine a selection of chilling new cases, many of which have never been featured on television before. Join me on a journey to the cliff's edge, where the land meets the sea, and where life meets death. We're on the Isle of Man in today's Murder by the Sea, where in 1991, Corinne Bentley thought she was heading to a job interview. The interview was fake and she ended up dead, in a very rare case for the island.
The Isle of Man's a relatively small, rocky outcrop, just 32 miles long by 14 miles wide, in the middle of the north part of the Irish Sea off the west coast of Britain. It has, for hundreds of years, been a holiday resort for people seeking quiet walks in what is genuinely a beautiful, spectacular location.
It's a lovely place to live, a lovely place to bring your children up. And as far as the police force is concerned, although it's an island and you don't have the sort of the major crime related to drugs and that sort of stuff in those days that you had with the UK, there's still a lot going on, and it was interesting. Douglas is capital of the island. The island's now got about 85,000 people, and about half of that population live in or around the greater Douglas area. There's no areas where you wouldn't want to walk and not feel safe.
In essence, if you had a burglary, you had a pretty good idea who would have done it, because we had a small community of criminals. It's the nature of the beast, isn't it? You'll always get the vast majority of people law-abiding. There's one or two that will always want to do it easier, do it the simple way, and would commit the crime.
There were a number of homicides, there were a number of violent crimes in the Isle of Man in the mid-20th century. But I think this was a particularly unpleasant crime. The motives made it particularly unpleasant, the means made it particularly unpleasant, and the youth of the parties make it horrible as well. So I think it's fair to say it was a shocking crime at the time.
Now, the Isle of Man is a curiosity. It's one of 3 crown dependencies of Great Britain, and it maintains the right to govern itself. And it retains its own set of judicial procedures and laws. They're known as Manx laws and procedures, which are separate from and often very different to those throughout the rest of Great Britain.
It's a small country, it has limited resources. If there's a good model of a law that England or Ireland or Canada or Australia has made, why don't you take that as your starting place? So actually, if you were visiting the Isle of Man, and I would strongly encourage everyone to visit the Isle of Man, if you were visiting the Isle of Man, it would feel very, very familiar to you. The laws would feel very, very familiar, but their basis is actually different. So for instance, there is no national speed limit on the Isle of Man. There are many speed limits in towns and, where necessary for safety, and they are imposed by an Act of Tynwald, not by an Act of Parliament.
If you ask anyone in Britain the date of the last death sentence passed for murder in this country, they'll almost certainly point to the mid-1960s. And they would be right. Almost. The last 2 men to be hanged for murders were executed in 1964. And the following year, the death sentence was suspended in mainland Britain. And in fact, in 1969, capital punishment was abolished by Act of Parliament for all crimes except treason. But the key word in all of this is mainland Britain, because the Isle of Man retained it. And that death sentence was the only sentence available under Manx law in 1992 for cases of murder. And the last person to be condemned to death for murder in the British Isles was Tony Tier. His trials and punishment played out have guaranteed him a place in British legal history.
The murder of Corinne Bentley takes place on the Isle of Man in July of 1991. Corinne was a single woman, aged 22. She lived alone, and she'd started a relationship with a local farmer on the island. Now, Corinne is described as being having mental incapacity to a degree.
Corinne herself wasn't from the Isle of Man. She was born in the Littleborough area of Rochdale, and she was said to have some kind of intellectual impairment that meant her mental age was around 15. Despite that, she had had a job working for older people.
She had formed a relationship with a local man, Elliot Kinvig. Now, Mr. Kinvig owned a substantial farm on the Isle of Man. It was 111 acres.
Elliot lived on a farm with his mother, his sister, and her husband, his brother-in-law. The farm was quite extensive. It was 111 acres, in fact, in total. And they farmed the usual agricultural products, grew various crops, and had a small amount of livestock. But within a short period of time, there was a great deal of resentment, apparently, in relation to Corinne residing at the farm. Although it's not documented exactly why, but it must have involved the ownership of the farm and the financial setup and etc., what would happen in the future. So much so that the family demanded that Elliot evict Corinne from the farmhouse and have nothing more to do with her.
Corinne was an innocent. She was vulnerable. She was like easy for people to pick on or to develop a dislike of, because they picked on that vulnerability. They felt she was weak. And you do get a sense with the Kinvigs wanting to get rid of her, that there's a lack of sympathy for her, a lack of understanding, and this desire almost to be better than her, to be more powerful than her, to show her what her place should be. This kind of dismissal of her life is really quite appalling.
Elliot and Corinne's relationship was pretty strong, and he in fact threatened the family and stated that, on the contrary, that if anyone was going to be evicted, he would evict them, not Corinne, and that she would remain with him on the farm. The resentment grew apparently over a period of weeks, and so much so that his brother-in-law approached a local lad living on the island up in Ramsey, Tony Tier, as he was known.
Tony Tier, at the time of the murder, was in his early 20s. He was an electrician, I believe, working for the brother-in-law of Elliot Kinvig. Now, Elliot was Corinne's boyfriend.
In July 1991, Tony Tier was in severe financial difficulties. He had originally come to the Isle of Man several years earlier from his hometown of Runcorn, near Cheshire. And he had a job as an apprentice engineer, but he ran up debts. And in the summer of 1991, the bank with which he had an overdraft was demanding immediate repayment. Tony Tier had no money, had no way of paying back that overdraft.
The brother-in-law made it quite clear to Tier that the family wanted Corinne gone, and in fact was quite blunt about it and actually told Tier that they wanted her dead. Quite bizarrely, Tier agreed that he would murder Corinne for them for the sum of £600.
It seems like such an overreaction. You know, if you have somebody living in your house who you don't want there anymore, there are steps you can take to get them to move. You know, why hire a hitman to kill them? It's such an overreaction and kind of quite inexplicable.
Tia was careful to negotiate a fee for killing Corinne Bentley, a young woman he had never ever met. And the price for murdering a stranger was set at £600. A very low figure, so it seemed to Tia, and genuinely was a low figure. It's worth only about £1,200 today. But since he was in such financial difficulties, he realised he had very little leverage and agreed to the price.
He arranged for Corinne to meet him on some remote moorland on the pretext of some kind of job interview, which again is quite bizarre how he managed to get her out onto that type of location. But you must remember that apparently she had some sort of learning difficulties. Tia met with Corinne and brutally attacked her and actually cut her throat with what was described as a Stanley knife or a modeling knife. And then he ran from the scene, leaving her to bleed to death. Now, incredibly, Corinne managed to stagger approximately 350 yards in the direction of a remote farmhouse.
She has this wound to her throat. She can't shout, she can't scream for help, and instead she's stumbling towards the nearest building, which is another farmhouse. And you kind of read the account of what happened to her and kind of really wish that she'd got to this farmhouse, that she'd been able to communicate and find help. But instead then she has this awful bad luck of falling into an unused silage pit, and there she dies. Often with cases of murder, you know, the answer is close at home. So the police look at the family, the family's friends, and kind of anyone they came into contact with. You know, you look at people's financial backgrounds, who might be struggling for money, who might have a reason to kill somebody or be hired to kill somebody, and find out what was going on here, you know, what the feelings of the family towards Corinne were.
We had no suspect as such because we had no evidence that a crime had been committed. All we had was a 23-year-old single girl who hadn't been in touch for a couple of weeks. So although we were concerned about her welfare, there was no suggestion or any evidence that harm had come to her. In '91, I was uniform inspector and classed as a divisional commander in charge of policing in Douglas. I spent most of my service in CID, but then I got promoted into uniform and went in charge of Douglas Policing, which is how I became involved in the Corinne Bentley case. Obviously, I was aware that we had a missing from home in relation to Corinne. A little bit more serious than normal because Corinne was a vulnerable young lady. She had learning difficulties, as we would say in these days. She was 23. And she hadn't been seen for a couple of weeks, and obviously that was worrying. So I went down to the CID and asked him would he put one of his experienced detectives on it in case somebody missed something, or somebody, you know, a witness often remembers things later. First of all, he goes to the boyfriend and asks him when did he last see her. Now, and he said he'd been the last time he saw Corinne he was with her, and a lad who he knows as Tony Tier stopped the car to speak to them. And Tony said to Corinne that he knew of somewhere that there was some work and he would take her there. Elliot didn't get in the car and Tony drove away with Corinne in the car. So that was one of the last positive sightings we had. Elliot, I think, also had a form of learning difficulty, but he came over quite genuine apparently, as did Tony Tier, because he said he'd had her in the car, give her a lift, he dropped her off. There was nothing to suggest anything untoward. And then there was another sighting, apparently, where somebody thought they saw her on a bus after Tony Tier had given her a lift. So at that stage, and really, they were the only people that really knew her. So there wasn't a lot more that could be done. The advantage of now is, of course, we've got social media, so as soon as you've got somebody missing, you can post it all over the place. But we didn't have it in those days, so it wasn't that easy to circulate to everybody. I mean, we had local newspapers, but not everybody reads a paper. So that was unusual, but I wouldn't say it was totally rare that a young person would go missing. Once we'd interviewed all the people that we could interview, there wasn't a lot more that could be done. So you're basically hoping she's either going to turn up, or a boyfriend and that sort of thing might come up with some information, because there was absolutely no evidence to suggest that anything untoward had taken place. And bear in mind the history of the tension in the house and what went on in the house. A lot of that didn't come out until the trial itself, so we didn't have that information at the time that Kareem was missing. One of the DSs came up to me and said he'd got the file and he was going to have a look at it, so thanks very much. And then he said he'd arranged for Tony Tier to come in to the police station for another chat. And I was actually in the control room when he came in, and Dave took him down to the interview room, which is towards where the cell block area is. And Dave hadn't been gone 10 minutes, perhaps even only 5 minutes, and he come back and he had this sort of shocked expression on his face, and I said, "What's up, Dave?" He said, and he just said, "He's coughed murder on her." A coughed obviously is the police slang for admitting, and he's admitted killing her, and just like that. That then, but a totally different complex on the inquiry. So then obviously he was then arrested on suspicion of murder, and then he got a lawyer, and then they took interviews, and it went from there. People confess to things they haven't done all the time. So following the interview with his lawyer, Tony agreed to take the police officers up to the scene where the attack took place. And when they got there, there was no sign of Kareem. But they did find an earring, and that was later identified as belonging to Kareem. So that was really the first main evidence that what Tony T was saying was correct. Because up to that stage, although he'd admitted to a murder, there was no evidence whatsoever to suggest that had taken place. And then it was decided the next day, because it was late on in the afternoon, that they get some police officers together and search the area, which is what they did.
As constable, I joined as a constable, and I retiring as constable 29 years later. I was in a divisional officer. The island was split into 4 divisions at that stage: Douglas, West, South, North, and I was in now called Onken and Laxey, which is the outskirts of Douglas into just north of Douglas, Laxey village area, and the countryside surrounding area. As a force, we had a hill search team. It's a rural community, small island, and there's always a risk that someone would take a fall out in the countryside. I had an interest in it. I was involved in establishing the team and involved in the training side of things. Primary function was to go out and search for people if they got into difficulties or got lost or they were injured. Probably the first recollection of it was the day we were told we were going out to search for her. We were aware that she'd been murdered. We had been called out the following day to do a search for her, because apparently it had been disclosed by Tia that he had murdered her or stabbed her, and they couldn't find her. So we were going to be called out en masse to look for her. We were aware there'd been an arrest. Obviously, word spreads for a small force, 200 plus officers. Word spreads very fast. I was on duty. I can't remember my duty the day before, but I was on duty and had heard there had been an incident, and as later on we were told we were being called out as the team up to look for her. Area called Druidale Farm. There's a track down there. We went up on I was transported up there. Incident room was there.
Druidale's not the place you frequent. You drive through it, but you don't go there unless you're going to a farm or something. The only buildings up there are farms, the odd farm building, but there's no and sheep, and basically that's it. It's very isolated, and the roads are very narrow up there. So, and it's not even a road that you would go to get from A to B. You only go through Druidale either because it's a nice day and the scenery's lovely, or you're going to visit a farm there. You wouldn't drive through it to get from one place to another.
There was the Hill search team, which I believe we were 10, 12 officers at that stage, but there was other uniformed officers there as well. And we were split into teams to search initially an area leading down to the farm and across the fields to look for Corinne and or any evidence relating to the incident. As with many roads on the Isle of Man, it's green. We have a lot of rain, so there's a deep gully to the side. Hedgerows there are gorse and brambles. So if you can hide someone, perfect location, the likelihood of being found quickly is remote. We started searching on the left-hand side of the track, and we did a sort of peripheral field. On the way, we searched one series of fields and turned to go across the bottom of the farm area, as it were. And we started coming back up through towards the farm and on the other side of the farm track. Part way up, there was a cesspit, the runoff from a slurry from the farm. Climbed up onto it, walked across, and I spotted what was, unfortunately, I spotted Corinne, and it was very obvious what I found, and I called it in on the radio at that stage, controlled the scene, and reported that unfortunately I'd found her. In the police, you're used to seeing things. I was surprised, shall we say, to find her, because looking for evidence, I wasn't expecting to find her. It's not the sort of thing that you want to find. Heartbroken for the girl and the family, obviously. It became a crime scene in essence. I called over the radio, aware that in those days the press were monitoring our radios. So I said, my recollection, something along the lines, I think I found what we're looking for, at which point the press descended on the incident room, so obviously confirmed they were thing. Senior officers came down, the scene was thing, and I was left to secure the scene.
This is such an overreaction to what the situation was. You know, she's an innocent woman in her early 20s. You know, she hasn't got any kind of obvious enemies. She hasn't done anything that could have enraged anyone. Why would she be the target for such a horrific crime? Was a young man sort of doing a very ordinary job on the Isle of Man, where not much of any interest kind of happened, certainly not in his locality or in his life. You know, having been paid to kill Corinne, he then starts to play into this idea that he is a professional hitman. This is a kind of identity that is far more exciting and glamorous in his mind than what he actually does. So he's talking to the police as though he is this big character. It makes him feel like he's a success, you know, even though he was hired to pay off a few kind of debts and he had no real beef with Corinne.
There wasn't a lot of forensic evidence because of the fact that she'd been out there so long. When you're exposed to the weather, the heat, the cold, so it's very, very difficult. Forensic evidence like that is not easy. It's not easy at all. They bring a team in from the UK, just like any small force would, and they get it very quickly. So the scene would be preserved with tarpaulin and stuff like that, and then they bring a forensics pathologist from the UK.
In any case where a body is recovered in an inclement situation, so as an example in a silage pit, then that produces challenges to the investigation that need to be overcome. And of course, it could lead to the removal of forensic evidence. It was evident in this case that the victim had sustained a really severe neck injury, which was believed to have been caused by a bladed instrument, and had also sustained beating injuries. So there was very clear evidence that this was a brutal attack and murder. It's apparent from the blood staining that Corinne Bentley actually survived her injuries for a time because she was able to move or travel between the site of attack and where sadly she collapsed and died. Certainly in a case like this, when individuals are found in a ditch or a deposition site, then there's a natural sort of instinct to believe that this isn't where the attack took place. And so in this case, because she had been injured somewhere else and then moved and left this trail of blood drops, then that would allow the investigators to travel back and find the site of the attack. And then at that site there might be other information such as tyre marks and other forensic evidence that can help them to piece the attack together. In terms of forensic evidence, then there's always a potential for that evidence to be retained and preserved, even in the most inclement of scenarios. We recover DNA from individuals that have been in water bodies for decades, so there is always the potential that we'll recover material even in cases like this.
Another thing about this particular case is, of course, contract killings are quite unusual. They're not that common, obviously. And the other thing about it is, of course, the small amount of money that was offered and accepted for such a brutal crime. I mean, to cut a young woman's throat for £600, even in 1991, that's a pretty drastic thing to do. Does it tell you just how desperate Tia was to obtain money, perhaps? Or does it say a bit more about him, about the type of individual he was? He's 19 years of age, and yet here he is. He's a man who's quite prepared to cut a young woman's throat and murder her for an amount of money to pay off a debt. He was quite callous and cold in one manner, in a comment that he made to officers during his confession, that he felt that he did it for far too less a sum and that he should have charged more for carrying out such a brutal act, which is quite a callous thing to say. He was charged, as I say, and he appeared before the courts on the island.
Manx law is different from English law. You don't have Acts of Parliament, you have Acts of Tynwald. You have judgments made by the Manx courts. They pay a lot of attention to English courts, but they make their own decisions. And obviously Manx legislation, Manx statutes being passed.
In the UK, murder was always subject to common law. And then later on they brought in legislation, I think they call it the Homicide Act, but common law is where law which has just evolved over the years. And then we had an old criminal code going back to about 1872, which covered a lot of offences. And so Manx law would be our own legislation passed by our own parliament, and not necessarily following the UK. In fact, in many cases, it was different than the UK. If a law is passed in the UK, it wasn't automatically passed in the Isle of Man. So, for example, a Theft Act in the UK came out in about 1968, I think, but the Isle of Man, it didn't come out till 1981. Just the way we did things here. Same with the court procedure. We would have, in the UK, they'd have 12 jurors, but in the Isle of Man, we still only have 7. Our judges are called deemsters, and we have our own appeals court, where they bring in judges from the UK for the appeals court. But ultimately, the person in charge of our court system is the Queen, or the King, or the Queen as it was then. So she has the overall power at the Home Office to deal with any criminal offences, any sentences which took place on the Isle of Man, which is what happened in the Tony Tia case.
The Police and Criminal Evidence Act, PACE, which had come into force in 1984-1985 and for the rest of Britain, didn't apply on the Isle of Man, and the protections it afforded to suspects, to those accused of crimes, were simply not available to people languishing on remand in jail in Douglas, Isle of Man's capital. When they got his confession, the police had not given Tony Tia access to a lawyer. Worse, when the murder weapon, the supposed murder weapon, the craft knife which had slashed Corinne Bentley's throat, was found by a local resident, the police blithely told him, "Oh, just throw it away and forget about it." And so when Tia's case came to court, he pleaded not guilty to murder and demanded that his confession, the only real evidence against him, should be excluded. He hadn't been given a lawyer when he made it. What's more, the knife had never been recovered, so there was no way of testing it for forensics. And for good measure, his lawyer also argued that the police on the Isle of Man had failed to disclose a host of other potentially exculpatory evidence. None of this mattered. Those laws, those protections simply didn't apply.
He just sat there. He never gave evidence. In fact, the defence didn't call any witnesses. They just relied on the old thing in law is that the prosecution have to prove their case. He didn't give evidence and there were no witnesses called. What came out of the trial was that there was some conflict in the household. But the family weren't happy with Corrine being a boyfriend of Elliot. So the common law husband of Elliot's sister went to Tony Tia and offered him hundreds of pounds. There was always a bit of question about what the actual words were, to get rid of her or to kill her, but that was what led up to Tony Tia getting involved. And there was some evidence later on that a large sum of money had been paid into his bank account at about the same time as this allegation was made. So there was some evidence to support that. I remember people saying, what? You know, they were hearing about it then, and it was obviously on the local radio and the newspapers, and it was a big, then the trial was a big thing. And even today, you know, people remember it and think about how horrific it all was. The trial only lasted 3 days, and I think the jury were out 7 hours. So it was a big event at the time, but it didn't last a long time, because as I say, it was a reasonably straightforward case.
And when the jury returned their verdict, they found Tony Tia guilty of the murder of Corrine Bentley. And the judge, the Deemster, as he's titled under Manx law, imposed the only sentence available under Manx law for murder: death.
The Deemster Callow, or the judge, Deemster Callow, just said you'd been found guilty, and the Deemster came out with what an horrendous crime this was on a poor innocent girl, and then he said, but you've been found guilty of murder, and I'm going to impose on you the only sentence that the law allows me to, and that is you'll be taken from this place and you'll be hanged by the neck until you're dead. And the way he said it, and it was quite a moment, to be honest with you. He could have cut the atmosphere with a knife. I'm not too sure whether people in there, a lot of people in there who were there, the family, quite realised what was going to happen. We did, because we knew what the law is. When I say me, the police officers who dealt with it knew, but any public that were in there would not have known. And when you hear a judge say something like that, in fact, the shivers have gone down the back of my neck now, thinking about it. I think you might find he was the last person in the British Islands to be sentenced to death.
We see the death penalty as being a product of a bygone era. It's something historical. It's what our less civilised ancestors did, you know, to convict someone and then send them to the gallows. And so this case was particularly shocking because it reminded people that even in the early 1990s, you know, this civilised era, there was still the death penalty on the Isle of Man, that the judge would still put on the black cap when they were sentencing someone to death. And it's that kind of remnant of this kind of less civilised, apparently, era that survived. And that's quite shocking, actually, when you think about how relatively recently this was. People are always surprised that the Isle of Man actually had the death penalty far later into the 1990s. Although it hadn't been carried out for some time, it was still on the statute books. The case has got a lot of interest because Tony Tier was the last man to be sentenced to death on the Isle of Man, even though people knew that it would get commuted. They knew that he wouldn't be executed.
Basically, up until the 1960s, you had a situation where the Isle of Man had capital punishment, execution, really for murder. That was the only crime which would result in a death penalty. And frequently they were commuted, dropped down to life imprisonment. In the 1960s, England, the United Kingdom, turned away from capital punishment. So you have the abolition of capital punishment for murder during the 1960s. The Isle of Man chose not to follow. So from the 1960s, you have this position where the Manx Tynwald has laid down in an Act of Tynwald that the mandatory punishment for murder is death. Meanwhile, less than 20 miles across the sea, in England, the Home Secretary would never allow the Manx authorities to execute. Imagine the political cost of a Home Secretary in a country which bans execution, allowing somebody to be executed for a crime in British territory 20 miles offshore, where the Home Secretary has the power to stop it by the exercise of mercy. So from 1960s up until 1990s, you have a pattern of convicted murderers receiving the prerogative of mercy down to life imprisonment, and it was quite clear to me from talking to some of the people who were involved around the time that this was not a matter of judgment. It was automatic. The Home Secretary would never allow a Manx murderer to be executed.
A court would sentence a man like Tony Tier to death and would remand him in a condemned cell in the prison on Douglas to await his fate. The condemned man would then apply to the British government to have that sentence commuted, and quietly the Isle of Man would agree. And that's what had happened in the 3 previous murder cases and death sentences which had been handed down in the second half of the 20th century. Tier's case was to be slightly different.
So Tier is convicted of murder, mandatory sentence is death. He knows he isn't going to be executed. Everybody knows he isn't going to be executed. He then secures a retrial, and between his first trial and his second trial, the Manx Tynwald says, actually, we can't carry on like this. It is not sensible to have a system where somebody has to be sentenced to death and we all know it's not going to happen. It makes a mockery of it. And so, in between those 2 trials, the Manx Tynwald abolished the death sentence in the Isle of Man.
He appealed, he got a new lawyer, and he appealed, and UK organisation that tries to deal with miscarriages of justice got involved because they felt that the case was purely based on a confession, just the confession and nothing else, because there was no forensic evidence. And two English barristers agreed to come over and represent him, and he was given a new trial. His appeal was granted. And much of the evidence of that trial was repeated. However, there was some extra evidence where a health worker who'd been interviewing Tony whilst he was in prison, serving a sentence, Tony admitted to him what he'd done in quite detail. So that health worker came along and gave evidence in the trial, and he was convicted on the second occasion.
This time, though, he was not sentenced to death because by 1994, when his second trial took place, the Isle of Man had finally caught up with the rest of mainland Britain, and the island's parliament, the Tynwald, had formally abolished the death penalty. Tony Tier was sentenced instead to life in prison.
He was both the last person to be sentenced to death and the first person to receive a mandatory life sentence after the death penalty was removed from the statutes. So that's why it's had so much attention from a legal history perspective. And I think because of that, we lose sense of what the actual crime was and who the victim was.
Initially, the Manx prison was actually the castle, so it was sort of a fortification which also doubled as a prison. Then there was a purpose-built prison in the Victorian era, but one of the big problems the Isle of Man faces is that the prison population is very varied. If you're a prisoner serving a short term for theft, you may be quite differently placed from somebody facing a life sentence for murder. So meeting the needs of different prisoners is really difficult. You have men and women may need to be treated differently, young offenders may need to be treated differently. So one of the ways the Isle of Man gets around that is to basically subcontract into the English prison system. And typically somebody with a very long sentence, particularly around the time of Tyr, would actually serve that sentence in an English prison. So Tyr was convicted in the Manx system, but because there weren't really the facilities in the Isle of Man to deal with a life prisoner, he was sent to a specialist unit in England which has long-term prisoners.
On the surface, it's a really sad, tragic, really, case of a hapless would-be murderer for hire and the disadvantaged young woman whom he slaughtered. I think the lesson which needs to be drawn from this is that the Isle of Man and the other two Crown dependencies like it are an anachronism. They are a loophole within our unwritten constitution, and frankly they're a loophole that needs to be closed.
I think if there hadn't been the Tyr sentence of death, there would not have been immediately following the abolition. Probably the Isle of Man would have abolished the death penalty in the next 10 or 15 years anyway. There were broader international things happening which would have made it very difficult to retain. But I think a recognition that rather than pretending to have the death penalty, the Isle of Man should recognise that mandatory life was the penalty for murder was a legacy of the Tyr trial.
At the centre of every murder trial, every murder case, there is a victim. And this is such a particularly sad case because Corinne's identity has been almost lost. She is remembered to her family, but when you see coverage about this case, it's focusing on the legal aspects of it, and therefore her murderer gets more attention than she does. He gets that status as being the last person sentenced to death, of being the first person to receive this mandatory life sentence. And who is Corinne? She should be at the centre of this, and instead she seems to be on the fringes while her murderer takes centre place, and that is really wrong.
Corinne and her family received the justice they deserved, definitely. And which I only played a small part of it, but the lads who actually investigated it, that's to their credit that they were able to bring justice to Corinne and her family.
At the end of the day, we're humans, we wear a uniform, whether or not you agree or disagree with what the police do. And there's often an argument, certainly in the Isle of Man, that where police officers are overpaid, it's a quiet place, they don't earn their money. And often enough, it's like in many jobs, you're not paid necessarily for what you do, it's what you may have to do. And I hope that the majority of people in the Isle of Man would never go through a number of incidents I've gone through and things I've seen and witnessed and had to deal with. It's probably the most memorable of things for a number of reasons, and it's one that haunts me. These sort of things they have an impact. It had an impact for a long, long time. It's still there now. I didn't used to talk about it. I suppose post-traumatic stress disorder, you call it, because I wasn't expecting to find her, and it's that sudden finding her. It does have a massive impact.
It was one of the most shocking in relation to the circumstances of it. It was one of the most surprising as to how it worked out with the confession straight away. I mean, that doesn't happen every day in the week. And it was a pretty horrific case as far as history of the Isle of Man's concerned. So it wasn't particularly nice.
In this case, it's Tony Tier who tends to be remembered because of his dubious status as the last man to be sentenced to death on the Isle of Man. But it's Kareem Bentley who should be remembered, killed for no reason for just £600.